At 2:47 in the afternoon Brussels time, something happened inside the glass and steel corridors of NATO headquarters that career diplomats are describing tonight as the most consequential breakdown in Western alliance politics since the Suez Crisis of 1956. 6 European heads of government, representing nations whose combined military expenditure exceeds $1 trillion annually, stood up from a scheduled working luncheon, pushed back their chairs without a single word of explanation, and walked out while Donald Trump was still mid-sentence. The room did not erupt into argument. It did not descend into shouting or recrimination. It went completely, devastatingly silent. And that silence, according to 3 senior European diplomatic officials briefed immediately on what took place, is the most alarming signal the Western alliance has transmitted in an entire generation of post-war diplomacy. I need you to understand the weight of what I am about to tell you, because this is not a story about table manners or diplomatic protocol. This is a story about whether the post-war architecture that kept the peace between nuclear powers for 80 consecutive years is still functional, or whether it cracked this afternoon in a way that cannot be quietly repaired at the next scheduled summit. If you care about American security, about the stability of the world your children and grandchildren will inherit, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because the next 72 hours will determine whether today's walkout was a final warning or the opening moment of a genuine and irreversible alliance fracture that will reshape global politics for decades. Here is what we know. According to 2 senior officials from European Council delegations, and 1 individual directly briefed by a member of the German Foreign Ministry staff within 90 minutes of the incident, the walkout was not spontaneous, it was not impulsive, it was coordinated with operational precision. The decision had been discussed the previous evening during a private dinner held at the Amigo Hotel in central Brussels, a dinner that American advance staff were not informed about and were not invited to attend. According to those sources, the European leaders arrived at NATO headquarters this morning, having already agreed on a clear and specific threshold if Trump repeated what they had described in their private discussions as the ultimatum framing, combining defense spending demands with unilateral trade tariff threats in the same presentation, they would exit the room together, without advance notice, and release a pre-drafted joint communiqué within 60 minutes of their departure. He delivered exactly that framing. They left. The communiqué went out at 3:04 p.m. Brussels time, 17 minutes after the chairs were pushed back and the room fell silent. That 17-minute timeline is not incidental. It tells you everything you need to know about how methodically and thoroughly this response was planned. Now let me walk you through exactly how we arrived at this moment, because this did not happen because of one speech or one bad meeting. This has been building for months across a carefully documented series of diplomatic episodes, and the sequence matters enormously to understanding what comes next. To understand why today's walkout carries the historical weight it does, you have to go back to February 14th of this year, Valentine's Day, when the Office of the United States Trade Representative published a 47-page preliminary assessment recommending tariff adjustments on European steel, aluminum, and automotive imports ranging between 25% and 40%. The document was not classified. It was not delivered through diplomatic channels. It was posted to a publicly accessible government website at 11:22 p.m. on a Friday night. European trade ministers discovered it, not through courtesy calls from Washington counterparts, not through advance briefings from the American ambassador, but through push notifications on their personal phones the following Saturday morning. According to a senior aide to French Trade Minister Sophie Lefebvre, who confirmed the precise timing to a Brussels-based correspondent at Politico Europe, the French delegation first learned about the assessment not from any human being in Washington, but from an automated news alert. That detail is not a minor administrative footnote. In diplomatic culture, a culture built over centuries on the principle that how you communicate is as important as what you communicate, being blindsided on a Friday night through a public website posting is not an accident of scheduling or an oversight by a junior staffer. It is a deliberate signal about how much your relationship, your sovereignty, and your partnership are valued by the party making the decision. 3 days later, On February 17, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz placed a formal call to the White House requesting a direct clarification conversation before the tariff assessment advanced to the implementation stage. According to two people familiar with the contents of that call, Merz received a return call, not from the President, not from the Secretary of State, not from the National Security Advisor, but from a mid-level National Security Council staffer, whose title and portfolio have no relationship to transatlantic trade policy. Merz, who governs the most powerful economy in continental Europe, whose country maintains the largest industrial export relationship with the United States of any European nation, and whose territory hosts approximately 35,000 American military personnel, was handed off to someone 3 levels below cabinet rank for a conversation about an economic decision that would affect hundreds of billions of dollars in bilateral trade. The German Foreign Ministry released no public statement about that call, but within 48 hours, according to sources familiar with the resulting internal communications, Merz had reached out personally and privately to the heads of government of France, Poland, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Italy. That personal outreach, conducted outside normal EU institutional channels, quietly and bilaterally, is the first organizational thread of what became today's coordinated and historically unprecedented walkout. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button right now, because what I'm about to show you next is where that initial coordination solidified into a formal operational commitment that has fundamentally altered the trajectory of transatlantic relations. The meeting that crystallized the European response took place on March 1st in Warsaw, not Brussels, not Paris, not Berlin, but Warsaw, and that geographic choice was itself a strategic communication to anyone paying careful attention. Poland is the NATO member nation that has spent the highest percentage of its gross domestic product on collective defense every year for the past 6 consecutive years. It is the nation most directly exposed to Russian military pressure along its 800-kilometer eastern border. It is the nation where the memory of what happens when Western alliances fail to hold is not historical abstraction, but living family memory passed between generations. Holding the coordination meeting in Warsaw was a message. These are the nations that take their alliance commitments seriously, that have spent what they promised, that have delivered what was asked of them. The implicit contrast with an American administration, increasingly perceived as transactional and unreliable, required no spoken articulation. According to a Polish government source cited by Reuters on March 3rd, the Warsaw dinner lasted 4 hours and 40 minutes. The subject of American trade pressure and the future of NATO's political foundations was on the agenda from the first course to the last. By the time the leaders departed, they had agreed on the operational framework, the threshold, the response, the communiqué language that executed with precision today. Smash that like button if you understand why this level of coordinated European action against an American administration's diplomatic approach is without any modern precedent in the history of the alliance. Before I show you the specific trigger that caused this walkout, you need to understand who these 6 leaders actually are, because this is not some random collection of minor European figures looking for attention on the international stage. These are the heads of government of the 6 nations that collectively represent 62% of Europe's total GDP, 71% of NATO's European defense expenditure, and more than 800 million citizens. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz is a former corporate attorney who spent years as a senior partner at BlackRock's European operations before entering politics. A man whose entire professional identity is built around understanding that enforceable contracts and reliable counterparties are the foundation of all productive relationships. French President Emmanuel Macron, who has been warning publicly since 2019 about what he called the brain death of NATO's political cohesion, has spent 6 years watching his analysis dismissed and his warnings ignored. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who previously served as President of the European Council, and who understands the institutional architecture of Western alliances with a depth few sitting heads of government can match, has been the most vocal in private about what multiple sources describe as his personal assessment that the alliance's political foundations require urgent reconstruction. These are not impulsive politicians. These are disciplined, experienced, and strategically calculating leaders who understand that a coordinated walkout from an American president's working luncheon carries consequences that will echo through diplomatic records for decades. They did it anyway. That decision tells you something about how serious the situation has become. Now, here is what most analysts and most media organizations are missing entirely about today's confrontation. And this is the specific detail that changes the complete meaning of the walkout, elevates it from a dramatic moment to a structural rupture. This was not primarily, fundamentally, or even substantially about defense spending percentages. Those percentages were the stated subject of the meeting. They were not the reason 6 heads of government stood up and walked out. According to 3 sources familiar with the pre-meeting briefing materials distributed to European delegation chiefs this morning at 8 o'clock at BFEM, the specific trigger was a demand that Trump's team inserted into the working agenda at the last minute, inserted at 9:47 p.m. BFEM, because the previous evening, according to a timestamp on the revised agenda document shared with a senior European Parliament official. The demand was this: that European nations sign a letter of intent committing to purchase a minimum of $40 billion in American liquefied natural gas annually for the next decade, as a precondition for the United States agreeing not to proceed with full tariff implementation on the announced schedule. The European leaders had arrived at NATO headquarters expecting a difficult but navigable conversation about burden sharing, collective security commitments, and the framework for a new defense investment compact. What they received instead, at 9:47 the previous night, with no consultation, no prior discussion, and no opportunity to respond before the meeting convened, was what multiple senior diplomats, officials are describing tonight as a commercial ultimatum wrapped in alliance language and delivered as a take-it-or-leave-it agenda item. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications right now, because the documentation surrounding that last-minute agenda modification is still being collected and verified, and I will be covering every development the moment it becomes available. Here is the response from the American side, and it is important to report this with full accuracy. A spokesperson for the National Security Council issued a formal, on-record statement at 4:15 p.m. Brussels time, 71 minutes after the walkout, characterizing the European leaders' departure as a pre-planned political performance designed for domestic consumption in advance of European parliamentary sessions. The statement described the president's remarks as constituting frank and necessary conversation about equitable burden sharing within the alliance and affirmed that the United States remained fully committed to the NATO framework and to the collective defense of all treaty members. 3 hours after that statement was released. However, a separate senior White House official, described by 2 reporters present at the background briefing as a senior aide speaking without attribution, acknowledged that the meeting agenda had been modified the previous evening and that European delegations had not been formally consulted on the modification before it was distributed to their delegation chiefs. That background acknowledgement directly and irreconcilably contradicts the framing of the official on-record statement. The official statement characterized European behavior as performance. The background acknowledgement validated the procedural grievance at the center of that behavior. 2 separate officials, 2 incompatible accounts. That gap is not an artifact of messaging coordination failures. It is evidence of a genuine internal disagreement within the American delegation about how to characterize what happened in that room, and that internal disagreement is, in the assessment of 3 diplomatic analysts consulted by the BBC this evening, more alarming for the long-term health of American alliance management than the walkout itself. Let me bring you to where things stand at this hour, and this is where the story escalates into territory that should concern every American, regardless of where you stand on NATO funding, trade tariff strategy, or any partisan question. Tonight, according to 2 European diplomatic sources and a report published at 6:33 p.m. by Der Spiegel, citing internal European Union communications, the European leaders who walked out today have collectively authorized their foreign ministers to begin the formal drafting of what is being described internally as a strategic autonomy protocol, a binding framework for coordinating European defense procurement, intelligence sharing, and economic policy with structurally reduced dependence on American decision-making cycles. Strategic autonomy as a concept has been discussed in Brussels policy circles for nearly a decade. What is new tonight, What makes this categorically different from every previous iteration of that discussion is that it is now being drafted not as a theoretical exercise in a think tank paper, but as an operational institutional response to a specific documented date-stamped event that occurred at 2:47 this afternoon. According to the Der Spiegel report, the protocol would establish a standing European consultation mechanism capable of making collective economic and defense decisions on a 72-hour timeline, a timeline deliberately engineered to move faster than American bureaucratic and political response cycles. Hit that like button right now if you understand what it means for American global influence when our closest and oldest allies are engineering institutional systems specifically designed to operate independently of American decision-making authority. Now let me walk you through the 4 scenarios on the table as of tonight, because the next 72 hours will determine which path the alliance moves down, and the probability assessments here are not reassuring. The first scenario, managed de-escalation, requires that the White House reach out directly to each of the 6 European leaders tonight or tomorrow morning, formally acknowledge the last-minute agenda modification as a procedural error, and agree to reconvene the conversation on restructured terms without commercial preconditions attached to alliance participation. According to diplomatic historians consulted by the Financial Times this afternoon, this outcome would require a degree of institutional self-correction and public acknowledgement of error that has no precedent in this administration's conduct of foreign policy. Probability, approximately 15%. The second scenario, parallel track diplomacy, sees American and European delegations continuing to hold scheduled NATO meetings and issuing coordinated statements for public consumption, while European nations simultaneously accelerate their strategic autonomy frameworks in parallel institutional tracks that gradually assume the functions NATO was designed to perform. The alliance remains nominally and legally intact, while its operational and political foundations hollow out progressively over an 18 to 36-month period. This is the scenario that the majority of European diplomatic sources consulted tonight are treating as their baseline working expectation. Probability, 45%. The third scenario, alliance fracture with economic escalation, unfolds if the tariff implementation proceeds on its announced timeline, while European nations respond with coordinated retaliatory measures targeting American agricultural exports, pharmaceutical pricing agreements, technology licensing frameworks, and financial services market access. NATO's command structure remains formally in place, while its political foundations erode to a point of operational unreliability that adversaries in Moscow and Beijing will be watching, calculating with great attention. Probability, 30%. The fourth scenario is the one almost no public analyst is discussing tonight, but which multiple sources are raising in private conversations with European correspondents, a formal European request, submitted through established diplomatic channels for a renegotiated NATO charter that restructures American veto authority over collective alliance decisions. This would be unprecedented in the alliance's 76-year history. It would be functionally irreversible once initiated. Probability, 10%. But 10% on an outcome that cannot be undone is not a number any serious strategic analyst looks at and dismisses as negligible. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell, because I will be covering every development in this story the moment it breaks, and the next critical data point arrives tomorrow morning when the joint European communiqué receives its first formal congressional response, and that response will tell us whether there are members of the Senate and House of Representatives willing to engage directly with allied governments before the fracture becomes structural and the window for repair closes permanently. Here is the broader significance you need to carry away from today's events, because this story extends far beyond one contentious working lunch at one summit meeting. The Western alliance, constructed in the years after 1945, was never simply a military arrangement between sovereign governments. It was an architecture of trust, a structure through which dozens of independent nations with competing economic interests, unresolved historical grievances, and fundamentally different political cultures agreed to coordinate their most consequential decisions about collective security and survival. That architecture absorbed extraordinary stress over 8 decades. It survived the Vietnam War and the protests it generated across European capitals. It survived deep transatlantic fractures over the invasion of Iraq in 2003. It survived the global financial crisis of 2008. It survived moments of genuine ideological divergence and bilateral friction that at the time seemed potentially fatal to alliance cohesion. What it has never encountered, in any previous iteration, under any previous American administration of any party, is a situation in which the founding power of the alliance uses the alliance framework itself as a transactional commercial platform for extracting bilateral economic concessions under explicit threat of security withdrawal. When 6 European heads of government coordinate a silent walkout, when they arrive at a NATO summit having already drafted, approved, and prepared for distribution their departure communiqué, they are not making a statement about the percentage of GDP their defense ministries allocate to collective commitments. They are making a statement about whether the foundational trust that holds the entire architecture together still exists in sufficient quantity to sustain the structure, and the answer they delivered today in 17 minutes, in complete silence, without a single spoken word of explanation, is that it is under strain more severe than any point in the alliance's post-war history. Drop a comment below right now and tell me, is today's walkout the opening chapter of a permanent realignment of Western alliances away from American leadership, or is this a high-stakes diplomatic tactic that will be resolved through back-channel negotiation within the next 30 days? I genuinely want to hear from you, because the range of informed opinion on this question is wide, the stakes are real, and your perspective as someone paying close attention to these developments matters to this conversation. Former NATO Deputy Secretary-General Alexander Vershbow told the Atlantic Council in a statement published just 2 hours ago that in his 30 years of alliance management experience, he has never witnessed a coordinated walkout by multiple heads of government from an in-progress working session with an American president, that such an event crosses a threshold in diplomatic signaling that cannot be casually undone or recontextualized by subsequent statements. That assessment, from a man who has spent his career navigating some of the most difficult moments in transatlantic history, should land with full weight. Subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, and stay with this story, because what I will show you in the next video, when the congressional responses land and the classified defense posture assessments begin to surface through the reporting process, will make everything you heard today look like the first page of something much larger, much more consequential, and much more difficult to reverse than anything the Western world has confronted since the Cold War's most dangerous hours. The walkout in Brussels lasted 4 minutes. The consequences it set in motion may last 40 years. And if you think that final number is hyperbole, I want you to remember that the Suez Crisis of 1956, an event that lasted less than 3 months, permanently ended British imperial power, permanently reoriented the entire architecture of the post-war Western world. Moments of diplomatic rupture do not announce their permanent significance in advance. They only reveal their full weight in retrospect, when the structures that were strained have either been repaired or have collapsed entirely. We are at that kind of moment tonight. I will be here covering every development as it breaks, every hour that this story demands attention. Make sure you are subscribed, notified, and right here when it does.